health, welfare, and safety. And I think it's clear that ready-mix concrete satisfies these two requirements, and this is why it's important for us to develop it as a compulsory standard and regulate it. So going further into that, ready-mix concrete is associated with a high risk, and because there's a significant level of local use. The product is all locally produced. It's used generally as a load-bearing component in structural systems. Trinidad and Tobago is susceptible to both earthquake and hurricane risk, and the existing regulatory framework for building construction needs strengthening at this time. So, as the executive director indicated, there are several other compulsory standards that TPS is currently enforcing. We would have recently revised the standard for rebar, and that is actively being enforced, and we are partially enforcing the standard for roofing sheets. And there will be a consultation next month on the rollout for the enforcement program for post-form framing members. We're also enforcing masonry standards, for instance, for concrete blocks and clay blocks. And we have been enforcing specifications for compulsory requirements for cement for quite a while now. So we would have quickly gone through the standard development process. So we are basically at the point where, at this point here, to obtain national and international comments during the public comment period. And after based on the comments we received today, we will review them and amend the draft if necessary. And subsequent to that, the standard will be submitted to our board of directors for approval. Once it's approved as a national standard, this is the compulsory standards order, which will make it a compulsory standard. And that is followed by the publication and seal of the standard and eventual enforcement. So some of the key stakeholders that we consider important are suppliers, producers, regulatory bodies, and users and contractors. And this is by no means an exhaustive list, it's just a representative list on some stakeholders we were able to identify. There's several we were able to identify and help with the Contractors Association, some of which are listed here. So when it's specifically into the public comment period, just to explain what we would have done, we are required by law to notify the public via newspaper advertisements, which we would have done on June 10th, 2016. We also utilize a notice on our website and out of the availability for public comment. And we also included a link to the draft standard and a link to submit comments. And we have received some very useful comments so far. The standard and the link will remain on the website after this session, so that you can continue reviewing and submitting comments on the draft standard until the public comment period is ended. We also would have, as part of our international trade obligations, notified the World Trade Organization, trading partners, that this standard is proposed as a compulsory standard. So that concludes the first part of the presentation, which is basically a background to the standard. So we're basically now going into the standard itself. So this is the scope of the standard. First, it applies to the production and supply of ready-mix concrete for buildings and civil engineering works. It applies to the ready-mix concrete delivered to the purchaser in an unhardened plastic state, and it applies to the constituent materials, plant and equipment, production control systems used in the production of ready-mix concrete. So it's important to know that there's a limited scope. The scope does not extend beyond delivery of the ready-mix concrete. It imposes compulsory requirements for constituent materials, measuring equipment, batching and dispensing equipment, mixing and agitating equipment, physical properties, and the information to be provided to consumers. The standard does not apply to side mix concrete used in the production of precast beams and columns, and the placement, consolidation, curing, or protection of ready-mix concrete. So some key definitions using the standard, these would have been based on the base standard, which is the ASTM C94. So producer is a personal entity producing fresh concrete. Purchaser is a personal entity specifying fresh concrete for the execution of a construction component. There's the ready-mix concrete itself, which is concrete manufactured and delivered to the purchaser in a fresh state. And fresh concrete that possesses enough of its original workability that it can be consolidated by intended means. So the excluded applications have a bit more detail here. So the side mix concrete, this is covered by the ASTM 685. There are several standards that pertain specifically to precast beams and columns. And the post-delivery treatment is excluded by the C94 scope and is covered by the ACI 308 specification. So this image here basically gives a pictorial overview of the scope of the standard and the types of activities that the standard covers. So you see at the bottom, the scope of the standard extends from the purchaser to delivery. And we'll go into the option A and C a little later on, but it starts from the purchaser specifications and covers the production control system at the producer and goes to the delivery conditions of the concrete, including the conditions at delivery as well as the information to be provided. And TTBS's testing activities will conclude at that point. Subsequent to that, we all know that their concrete at that point is not finished, but there's post-delivery activity, very important post-delivery condition activities to occur. And they have listed them there, but it's important to know that the standard does not address these activities. So we would have just to describe a bit the performance-based approach. So when the early days of standards development, many standards were descriptive in that the specification for how a product was to be designed or built was built into the standard. An example of this, for those familiar in the industry, could be seen with the ASTM approach with the cement standards. So the standard for Portland cement, the standard for blended cement are both prescriptive in that they specify both the constituent materials as well as the performance requirements. The trend lately has been, however, to move towards a more performance-based approach, and that is also evident, as I mentioned, with some of the later ASTM standards, such as the ASTM C1157, which does not specify the constituent requirements for the cement, but specifies only performance requirements. Now, both approaches have their pros and cons. The prescriptive approach allows reliable, repeatable, known performance. When you order a particular thing according to that standard, you know exactly what you expect from it. And in some cases, it allows for fine-tuning due to job site requirements. On the other hand, the performance-based requirements facilitates production innovation. It allows the producer to use innovation to achieve the same objectives and to improve their own internal production efficiency. So the C94 incorporates both approaches. There's a prescriptive approach, which is specified as option B under the C94. And there's a performance approach, which is specified as option A and C under C94. It's important to note that our standard, TTS 16, only covers the performance-based orders. That is option A and C. So it's important to note that option B orders would not be regulated under the standard. Now, it doesn't mean that option B orders would not be allowed or would not exist. They can't, purchasers would be free to go ahead and if it's necessary to make an option B order, but the enforcement activities of TTPS will not cover that. And I'll explain a bit more why later here. So we've listed the three options, A, B, and C, and categorize them according to show some of the key differences. So basically in relation to the option responsibility for the mixture proportioning compressor strength, and who takes responsibility for that. So it's evident from this table here that in option A and C, the producer takes the responsibility for the mixture proportioning, or the design, or another term within the industry is the mix design. How the proportioning of the cement, aggregate, water to get the desired strength and other properties at the end. And in options A and C, that responsibility rests with the producer. So the producer would specify what the target compressor strength is, and they are responsible for determining the mix design. Option C is a bit of a hybrid because it allows the purchaser to also specify the admixture content and the minimum cement content. But option B, the purchaser takes full responsibility for the mixture proportions and also takes responsibility for the compressor strength. The last row indicates the information to be provided by the manufacturer to the purchaser upon request, and to support whichever system is used. So going into the relationship with the TTS 16 standard to the other standards. Now this standard is based on the ASTM C94 standard, and we understand, so, and that standard itself references several other standards. So the constituent materials are listed here, not all of them, but some of the key ones, and I would have highlighted the standards for cement, including our national standard for cement, which itself directly references the and is equivalent to the three ASTM standards, which are the C150, the C595, and C1157. I've also listed some of the key test methods that would be used to support the standard. In addition to the core, what I consider the core requirements in terms of test methods and constituent materials, there are other supporting standards that are very important, such as the ACI code requirements, which this standard is intended to work in support of. So there's a whole ecosystem of standards pertaining to concrete design and installation and usage, and which are specified under the ACI 318 building code, and so the standard is just one piece of that whole framework. And there are other important international standards. So in some may be familiar with the British standard, the 5328, which has since been replaced by an European standard, the EN 206, and there's a national standard which is meant to complement the EN standard, which is the BS 8500. So the 8500 one, two, both meant to work with the EN 206 standard. There are also two international standards, the 22,965 parts 1 and 2. And actually I've compared both of them. The European standard and the ISO standard are very similar in their approach. So we understand that some of the industry may still be using the British specification. So we would need to ensure that there's compatibility with those requirements and the TTS 16 as we move forward towards implementation. So we're now specifically into the requirements of the standard, and we start off with the constituent materials. So on the left is an excerpt of the standard itself, which lists the requirements, starting off with the cement, then going on to the fly ash and pozzolans, slag cements, silica fume, aggregates, water, and mixtures. I've also exhibited the relevant passage of the C94, and you can see on the last part of the image that the link to the relevant standards. The big standard on the left there is the national standard for cement, the TTS CRS 54. So the next key requirement of the standard pertains to measuring equipment. So measuring equipment shall satisfy the tolerances of clause 9 of the ASTM 294. And I've extracted the requirements here on the right side of the image, right, which are contained in clause 9. Going on to the next key requirement, batching and dispensing equipment. And this has satisfied the requirements of clause 10 of the ASTM 294. And I've extracted, you can see what's taken from the C94 requirements here. The other key requirements is mixing and anti-teething equipment. And these are taken from clauses 11 and 12 of the C94, which are listed here. And there's the final requirement under the production control system of the concrete trucks used for mixing and delivery. And this is based on clause 12 of the C94. So the outside, you will remember the diagram that had the production control system, and we have covered everything under that. So outside of that now, there's the delivery conditions. So the first part of the delivery conditions to the purchaser would be the actual information provided to the purchaser. And there's a delivery ticket which has to be provided to the purchaser, and the standard lists the requirements here, which are taken from the clause 14 of the ASTM 294. And the final part of the delivery is the product itself, the fresh ready-mix concrete. And there are two tests that are applied to that, applied to the fresh concrete. One is the slump test, which is done at the time. And another test is, well, not done at the time, but a specimen, a sample of the concrete, of the fresh concrete is collected and put into a mold, either cylindrical or cuboid mold, and cured. And after 20 days, it's tested for the compressive strength to determine what the compressive strength is. So these are the key requirements, and these are the tests. And my colleague later on, next colleague with Shane, would go into more detail about the testing procedures. So the standard is a compulsory standard, and the intended means of enforcement will be via the evaluation of the production control and quality system. And this will be done by the TTPS certification division, and which will be doing another subsequent presentation. So that concludes my presentation on the draft standard, and I look forward to your questions in the final session. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Darrell. I would now like to introduce the next presentation. It will be done by Mr. Shane Manbode. Shane Manbode is a multidisciplinary professional with skills and experience in the fields of mechanical materials and inspection engineering. He graduated from the University of Trinidad and Tobago with a bachelor's degree and a diploma in mechanical engineering. He previously worked as an engineer at Petrotrin's Pointe-à-Pitre refinery in the inspection, reliability, and design engineering departments, and currently works for the Laboratory Services Division of TTBS. At his current job in the Materials Product Lab, he is involved in testing metallic materials such as various ferrous and non-ferrous metals and alloys. So I'd like to invite Shane to start his presentation.
Thanks, Nadita. Good morning, everyone. Is everyone able to see the PowerPoint and hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So good morning again, everyone. I hope all is well with you and your families at this time. I would like to thank you all for attending today's Stakeholder. My name again is Shane Manboard, one of the standards officers for the Material Products Laboratory at the TTDS with my colleague, Mr. Kevin Lemsey. My presentation today will be on the physical property requirements for ready-mix concrete product specification. First, I would like to preface this presentation by stating that the Materials Products Laboratory does not perform civil testing at this time. We specialize in testing, again, with metallic materials such as various ferrous and non-ferrous metals and alloys, steel reinforcing bars, unpainted roofing sheet, cold formed steel, and welds. This presentation will cover basic information about the types of testing required by the new compulsory standard for those of you who are not familiar with ready-mix concrete sampling and testing used for quality control and guided by ASTM C94. The use of other international standards will be discussed later on by Mr. Thompson, such as BS, BSE, and ACI, AASHTO, etc. So in this presentation, I'm going to cover the scope of physical tests required by the new compulsory standard, the purpose of these tests, how sampling is done, how these tests are performed, the relevant standards which these tests are performed in accordance to. As per the new compulsory standard, clause 4.2, table 2, shipments of ready-mix concrete shall be accompanied by a delivery ticket and shall satisfy purchaser's order requirements. So these are the physical properties which I'll be discussing: compression strength, yield, and slump. So ASTM C94 references ASTM C172, which is the standard practice for sampling of freshly mixed concrete. In the interest of time, this is a basic overview of the test method, but the elapsed time shall not exceed between 15 minutes between obtaining the first and final portions of the sample. The sampling is only done after all water and admixture is added. After sampling the concrete, wet sieving can be performed if the aggregate is larger than the designated size. Sample must be remixed before testing. Within 5 minutes of obtaining the sample, a slump test as per table 2 and other tests can be performed. Within 15 minutes of obtaining the sample, molding of specimens for strength tests can be done. So what is a compression test? It's a test which a compressive axial load is applied to a molded cured concrete cylinder or cubed or drill core until failure occurs. The compressive strength of a specimen is calculated by dividing the maximum load achieved during the test by the cross-sectional area of the specimen. Why perform compressive strength tests? Concrete's compressive strength determines whether the concrete placed in a structure can bear the weight of what's on top of it, or if it will splinter into pieces and cause the structure to collapse. As a result, it is highly important for everyone involved to know how strong the concrete being supplied is. So for this example, C94 references ASTM C39, which is a standard test method for compressive strength of cylindrical concrete specimens. Specimens should be kept moist and prevented from drying out before testing. The testing machine error shall not exceed 1% of the indicated load. The machine must be capable of applying a load at a continuous rate. The testing machine shall be equipped with 2 steel bearing blocks with hardened faces, one spherically seated and one fixed solid block. These are some guidance with respect to calibration of the machine. Note that compression specimens are also molded in the form of cubes as for BS and BSE and standards, etc. In this example, there's a basic overview of the procedure for conducting a compressive strength test as per ASTM C39. The cured specimen is obtained. The diameter of the specimen is measured, which is essentially the average of two measurements at mid-height. The axis of the specimen is aligned with the center thrust of the spherically seated block with an appropriate unbonded or bonded cap. For this example, we have an unbonded cap used. The load indicator of the machine is set to 0. A load is applied continuously without shock at a rate of movement corresponding to a stress rate of the specimen of 0.25 plus or minus 0.05 megapascals per second, or 35 plus or minus 7 psi per second. When the cylinder breaks, the maximum load, the type of fracture, and the compressive strength is recorded. What is concrete yield and why is it important? Concrete yield is defined as the volume of freshly mixed concrete from a known quantity of ingredients. Ready-mixed concrete is sold on the basis of volume of fresh, unhardened concrete in cubic yards or cubic meters as discharged from a concrete truck. So if you calculate a certain amount of cubic yards or meters of concrete required and for a particular foundation here, after the concrete is delivered, there is still more concrete needed, though this can result from a number of factors. Knowing about concrete yield can be helpful. Some example of yield problems can originate from miscalculations of form volume or slab thickness when actual dimensions exceed the assumed dimensions, deflection or distortion of forms resulting from pressure exerted by the concrete, irregular subgrade, contamination of aggregates, and settlement of subgrade prior to placement are some of the reasons. So ASTM C94 references ASTM C138, which is a standard test method for density, unit weight, yield, and air content for concrete. The following apparatus is required for a density unit weight test: a balance. Depending on the slump, a tamping rod or a vibrator may be utilized. So example, if the slump of the concrete is greater than 3 inches, the sample may be rodded. If the slump of the concrete is less than 1 inch, the vibration may be used. If the slump is between 1 and 3 inches, vibration or rodding is acceptable. A measure is also required. The size of the measure is dependent on the maximum aggregate size. A strike-off plate, a mallet, a scoop, and there's a certain number of strokes per layer. So again, this is a basic overview of ASTM 138, density unit weight. The sample is obtained as per ASTM C172, which is a practice for sampling freshly mixed concrete. The mass of the measure is measured first. The first layer is filled and rodded 25 times and tapped with a mallet 10 to 15 times. This procedure is repeated for the second and third layers. When striking off the excess concrete, press the plate on 2/3 the surface of the measure and a sewing motion withdraw the plate. Then press the plate to cover back the original 2/3 and with a vertical pressure, you sew in the opposite direction. Then incline the plate and strike several sweeps with the edge of the plate to produce a smooth finish. Clean excess concrete around the measure and determine the mass of the measure filled with the concrete. So how is yield calculated? The volume of fresh mixed unhardened concrete in a given batch is determined by dividing the total weight of materials by the average unit weight or density of the concrete, as determined by ASTM 138. As a rough check, a mixer truck can be weighed before and after loading. The difference is the total batch weight. So first, you need to calculate the density, which we would have already known the weight of the measure and the weight of the measure with the concrete divided by the volume, you get the density. If you have a batch ticket with the weight of, let's say, 27,300 pounds with a design volume of 7 cubic yards, simply divide the batch weight by the density you just got and multiply with this factor, and you got the actual volume of concrete in cubic yards. So relative yield is the ratio of the actual volume to the design volume. So a value greater than 1 indicates an excess of concrete has been produced. A value less than 1 indicates the concrete batch is short. What is a slump test? Simply put, concrete slump refers to consistency, by extension, the workability of a concrete mix. Slump can also be described as how fluid the concrete mix is and is also an indication of the ratio of the water to cement in your concrete. If it has a high slump rating, it is more fluid and workable. Conversely, a lower slump rating means less fluid and workable. So Why do a slump test? Understanding the consistency of your concrete mix is useful. Essentially, it allows you to preview what your concrete will be like before it sets, allowing you to make adjustments to the mix to create a better product with more favorable consistency. ASTM C94 references ASTM C143, which is the standard test method for a slump of a hydraulic cement of concrete. The following is the apparatus required for performing a slump test: a mold in the shape of a frustrum of a cone, a base plate, a tamping rod, a measuring tape or ruler, a scoop, and depending on the maximum aggregate size, a sieve may be used. If any aggregate is larger than 1.5, it will be wet sieved. So this again is a basic overview of the slump test. Obtain the sample as per ASTM C172, which is sampling freshly mixed concrete. The interior of the slump cone is inspected and all of the testing equipment is moistened. The equipment is set on a flat surface whilst standing on the tabs. The first layer is poured into the cone and the layer is rodded 25 times. Second layer is also filled into the cone, rodded 25 times to penetrate the first layer. The third layer again is repeated and rodded 25 times to penetrate the second layer. Excess concrete at the top of the mold is screened using the tamping rod. The excess concrete around the base is removed. The mold is then lifted in 5 plus or minus 10 seconds, and the mold is placed on an inverted position, and the slump is now measured from the top of the mold to the displaced center of the slump. So this brings me to the end of my brief presentation. I hope I was able to properly convey to you what these tests are, why they are important, and how they are performed. And I thank you for your attention. I'll now pass it on.
Thank you, Shane.
Okay, thanks, Anita.
I will now like to introduce Ms. Michelle Bihari to do the next presentation. She will be doing a presentation on the conformity assessment method for ready-mix concrete. Michelle has 10 years working experience at the Trinidad and Tobago Bureau of Standards, and she has a background of manufacturing, production, and testing services. She would have started as an inspector in our implementation division, inspecting products in retail, as well as at the ports of entry. At the certification division, she is now responsible for a number of different programs to safeguard health, safety, and the environment. There are mandatory product certification systems that she has responsibility for. She directly works on program development and oversight of product certification systems for locally manufactured products, which are sold within Trinidad as well as regionally. She has a BSc in chemistry, a BSc in environmental and natural resources management, and is pursuing an MBA in business administration. She is also a lead auditor certified for ISO 9001 quality management systems, as well as ISO 14001 on environmental management systems. I invite Michelle to start sharing her presentation. Thank you, Michelle.
Oh, apologies, I was talking with my mic muted. Hi, good morning, everyone. Welcome, stakeholders. Glad that everyone is here to join us. Just like to say thanks to Glenn, Victor, Andrew, and Shivanan so far for your comments and your recommendations. My name is Michelle Bihari. I'm the officer in charge of product certification. And my presentation this morning, very brief, because it's just a broad overview of the conformity assessment method, which is product certification, that we will be using for the ready-mix concrete standard. And just to give you a perspective, of course, that we are here this morning to garner feedback, your comments, your recommendations, your suggestions, of course, because you are all are the experts in the field, and you will bring a wealth of knowledge and of experience, of course, to this product. And what we will do when we finalize these requirements, of course, is to enforce it through a product certification method. So it's crucial at this point that we do get your comments, because it will direct the way in which it is that the regulation is laid out and rolled out in the coming future once it is that the standard has been declared. So without further ado, Nidita, for some reason, I'm not able to control my screen.
Michelle,
I'll try.
I
Okay,
recommend.
I'll try it again. Yeah.
Yes.
Thanks. So product certification is governed by ISO 17067. What this means is that it's an internationally recognized and accepted methodology for conformity assessment in ensuring that products meet specified requirements. Now, these requirements can be in local, regional, or international standards. One of the main merits of product certification is that it can facilitate trade. It can facilitate market access, fair competition, and consumer acceptance of products on a national, regional, and international level. Not only that, but the most important point, of course, is that a certified product provides consumer with an increased confidence. Confidence in the performance, safety, reliability of your product. And of course, that constitutes trust when it is that they do make a purchase from you. Now, with mandatory product certification, it's used, of course, to mitigate risk. Now, some of the direct risks are risk to health, to safety, and the environment. And my colleagues, of course, would have touched on it in their presentation that they were going. One risk that we don't usually talk about, but it's an indirect risk that is mitigated, of course, is the financial risk. So let's say, for instance, we are dealing with the ready mix here, and we have a pour that has been cured, and of course, it may not have met the specs. So it's a cost to the consumer, of course, to replace it, or sometimes it's warranted, the supplier does. But in addition to that, there's cost on both sides. Particularly for the supplier, when it is that you deal even further indirect costs, when you deal with the brand management, your brand management, and of course your reputation, the integrity of that after having something that may not have worked or performed in the way that it was intended to. So through a certification, product certification is actually a third-party assessment. So you have actually someone on board stating, giving the customer that assurance, of course, that, okay, this is what it is that we said, this is how the performance of our product, and don't take our word for it, right? We have a third party who's independent stating that, yes, we reviewed our processes, we reviewed the product, and we're saying that, yes, it's suitable for the intended use. Now, product certification takes a couple steps. And again, I'm just giving a broad overview here this morning. We will talk about this in detail. Once the standard is declared, we will have another stakeholder meeting where it is that we will invite you all and we will go through the process steps to become certified in detail, inclusive of the sampling frequencies, the point at which it is that we will be sampling. For this morning, of course, the purpose of us is just to finalize the requirements. And from that, we will do the rollout of the methodology for enforcement. So the first stage in a product certification process is the application phase. And this is where we get to know the company. We know anything that is unique about your processes, your production, etc. And following that, we will have an audit if it is that you have a quality management system in place, or just the audit of the quality control systems in the absence of a quality management system. So we will review those processes and the controls that are in place with that. And we will also sample and test the product. At which points, again, when it is that we do reconvene at the next stakeholder meeting, we will identify those points for sampling and testing. Once there are no gaps identified, or if there are gaps that are identified and we've closed it off, we then recommend you for certification. And certification, we issue a license certificate, an example of which I'll show you in the next slide, in addition to a product certification mark. And the product certification mark can be used because that is how you attest and you demonstrate to the consumer yourself that you have been assessed and your product is certified. Now, the product certification is not a one-off process. There will be continual surveillance. So after you initially get certified and the certification lasts, it's an annual certification. So during that period of that 12-month period that we do have, there will be continual surveillance that will be taking place. So as I said, I'm just showing you an example of what a license certificate looks like, and of course the product certification mark. So for the ready-mix concrete, the evaluation of the production control and quality systems, I've just touched on a few of them, which I will just go through just broadly, right, and briefly, of course. So the first one is your raw materials. And with your raw materials, the cement, aggregates, admixtures, water. And what we'll be looking at when we look at raw materials, of course, is if it is that you're purchasing from a supplier, what purchasing specifications do you ask for from the supplier when you're ordering the material? What verification checks you may do? Do you do a certificate of analysis, or do you do in-house checks when it is that you bring in the raw materials? Plant and equipment. So any equipment involved in the measurement, batching, dispensing, mixing, agitating, and transport of the ready-mix concrete, we will be review the records of the checks done on the maintenance and upkeep of these. For control of measuring devices, so any type of device that is used to take a measurement, and sometimes measurements are done on raw materials in processed products, or the end product. There may be certain tests that the customer may require, and then we have, of course, testing, on-site testing when once the product is delivered. So any of the equipment that are used to take any form of measurements, how it is that you control that equipment to ensure that the results that you're getting are accurate. Controlling non-conforming product. Non-conforming product can occur, of course, your raw materials, in processed materials, situations where the concrete again is already placed and you may have a customer complaint. How do you deal with those non-conformities? How do you correct it? And most important, what may you put in place then to prevent it from happening again? In the area of transportation, review of checks done, agitator trucks, customer requirements as it deals to delivery at the site. Traceability, pretty straightforward. It's just a review of the mix and to identify the individual constituents that make up that mix. Now, as we had said, we are dealing with a product certification methodology here. And we have had successful mandatory product certifications have been running for some time. So ready-mix, of course, is just another product that we do intend of starting with. So one of our first roofing sheets, which is covered by TTS 69 2019. This standard was first issued in 2012. We've had it's been running under mandatory product certification since then. It has just been revised, of course, to include, because it was just for the Alu-Zinc. So it's just been revised to include the colored sheets. We have hollow clay blocks. And again, part of the standardization, we do review standards, especially those sort of at regulations. Then after we've looked at the market, and you would agree, of course, in any industry, the market is dynamic. And what we try to do, just as this is the initial stage here with the ready-mix concrete. After a period, of course, of regulation, if the market change, if there's different technologies or whatever, the standard will be reviewed to update to reflect what is going on in the market. So another construction good that we have under mandatory product certification is cement. We have some household cleaning chemicals, which is liquid chlorine bleach. laundry detergent is the newest to the lineup. And what we're looking at in the future, of course, is the cold form steel products. And our executive director, of course, would have invited you. The rollout for this stakeholder meeting is on the 25th of August next month. So I would just again like to reiterate and reoffer the invitation to all the stakeholders here to attend on the 25th of August. Another future product that we'll be looking at is concrete blocks, and of course, the ready-mix concrete that we are here to deal with. And this brings me to the end of the presentation. I want to thank you all for attending. I hope you all are well, and just like to emphasize on the point that it's crucial that we get your comments and your feedbacks on the requirements so that it will direct us in how it is that we will regulate this product once the standard is declared. So thank you all. Take care.
Thank you, Michelle, for providing that overview of the proposed certification scheme for this particular product. We would now like to go into the segment that deals with feedback, and I invite Mr. Darrell Thompson to start off the discussions. We have received some questions in the chat already, so we will start with that, and I'd like to ask participants to include any additional queries in the chat window so that we can address them. So Darrell.
Okay, thank you, Nelita. So I will start with the questions that we would have received so far in the chat. Give me 1 minute. Okay, so one question had to related to the list of ready-mix producers and aggregate producers. As we indicated, the list was non-exhaustive. Well, I suggest maybe you contact the Contractors Association for listing of people who are registered with them. Next question. I see the inputs have been linked to ASTM standards. What is the position if the production meets other production standards such as the BSEN, AAT, SCH, and CRD? Would these inputs be accepted? So first of all, we would want to, where there exists others standards in use locally, we want to ensure that we make accommodation for them. So that's the overall principle that we'll be using. And that's one of the reasons we have in this event to ascertain what is in place right now within the industry. I would also say, however, that the C94 standard is not let's say, a product specification standard. It's more of like a process standard, identifying requirements for broadly for the inputs, the processes on processing equipment, measuring equipment, and outputs. While it does specify specific requirements for the product standards, such as the standards for the cement, that could be modified to accommodate other inputs where they're used in the local market. But for instance, with cement, basically it's the ASTM cement types, as far as I understand, that are locally used. So that general approach, where the focus is on the production control system, is similar to the approach used in the EN 206. It's just that the EN 206 goes a bit more into the specific aspects in terms of the mix design and specifying concrete classes that is not within the C94, but it's actually within the A113. So broadly speaking, the two standards in principle are not that different. It's just the specific requirements for cement, maybe aggregates, might be different. And where there are those differences, we'll look at that to ensure that there's no challenge to companies who are using the the EN standard. Next question. So the many other standards must be analyzed to get the best for local conditions, and there's a recommendation for the NMX C155 standard that includes requirements for durability. So, and so useful comment, and we could research further to determine how suitable this requirement is locally. Going on to the next question. Given that aggregate is a major input to concrete, is TBS the developing a compulsory standard for aggregates? So TTBS has an existing voluntary standard for aggregate, which is TTS 595, which is due for review. And we would make reference to the standard in our standard for ready-mix concrete. We have to determine moving forward whether the new standard for aggregate would be a compulsory standard as a supporting element for this standard. I would say add as well though that having a compulsory standard for aggregates is not okay. Let me rephrase it. The standard for ready-mix does not require a compulsory standard for aggregate. It would be beneficial to have that, but whether or not there's a compulsory standard for aggregate, the onus is still on the producer to ensure that their inputs satisfy the requirements. So yes, we would want to raise the overall level of the industry, and as I said, we have to make a determination as to whether the standard for aggregate would be compulsory, but whether or not that exists, the owner still remains, the final responsibility still remains with the producer. Even if there were a compulsory standard for aggregate, the final responsibility, at least for the ready-mix concrete, would still rest with the producer. And yeah. Next question: is there an ACI requirement for the person conducting sampling and testing, and is this requirement referenced in the TTBS standard? So, answer the second question. First, no, we are aware of the requirements. It's not referenced at this time, and it's something we probably need to look into further, because we will need to ascertain the level of this qualification and how many competent people there are locally who have up-to-date qualifications in this area. But ultimately, the certification division, as the one administering the enforcement program, would be the one to determine as a client what their requirements would be. So let me take a look at the chat and see if there are any other. I had recorded this earlier, so let me just quickly look and see if there are any additional comments that came up. All right, so a couple came in. All right, so just going to the chat again. So I see Mr. Cadenas mentioned that the members list is on the website. There's a comment. Okay, so there are several inputs to production that have no applicable standards, such as clays used for rheology. How would these be treated? So this is something we have to investigate further. Thank you for the comments. The note Next comment. The note at the end of page 6 regarding water is a bit superfluous, as C94 permits the addition of water on site for the purpose of sump adjustment. If such advice is deemed necessary, then it may be more prudent to indicate that the water in excess of the design mix should not be added, and if added, must be metered in. So, thank you for the comment. We'll consider that in terms of the water concerns about addition of water and affecting the water cement ratio, but we consider this comment in light of that concern. The agreement with the previous comment, locally strengths are specified as either cube or cylinder, with the standard reflect this difference. So the standard was based on the presumption of the SMC 94 presumption of cylinders, but we've received initial early comments that that there's also widespread use of the cube locally, so we would have to make adjustments to the standard to ensure that it accommodates both cylinder strengths and cube strengths. Next comment. Going back to the ASTM standards, concrete additives, admixtures have very different standards, as well as many different certifying agencies. One admixture can be approved by ASTM, but also ASTO, Corps of Engineers, CN, BS, EN, etc. The question is, if an additive or admixture is certified by an external international body, say DIN, would this be acceptable by the TTPS and an approved input? So that's a good question. It relates, I guess, to the issue of the other types of control systems and governance standards. So it's something we have to look at further, especially in relation to the degree of equivalence of other inputs, especially with the admixtures. So that's for that comment.
I would just like to add, in 5.3 of the standard, it states that TTBS may consider and accept information from other sources such as third-party testing, product certification, and/or quality management system certification from an accredited body. So as part of the certification program that is being developed, and Michelle would have highlighted that we are still very early in the development of the overall conformity assessment scheme, it does allow for equivalence and for the acceptance of other standards as well as other certifications from other jurisdictions. So to answer the question directly, yes, it is possible, but it would probably be done on a case-by-case basis. And the certification division will consider this in the rollout of the mandatory product certification scheme. So I would also like to invite Michelle to comment on this part as well.
Yes, Narita. So the product certification, as again, we work within the requirements itself, and part of the process that we do, and I would have touched on this, of course, in the presentation, dealing with if there are the unique areas of the processing determined by the manufacturers, etc. So it's not it may not be a sort of a broad brush. There will be standardization in it, but all things will be considered in the rollout and the design of the regulatory program.
Thank you, Michelle. There's a question that is related, and Victor would have commented that all standards deal with the same measurement parameters, such as reduction of water, setting time, initial and final percentage of compressive strength through their age. So it does allow for a degree of equivalence to be considered. And I think Devendra has the most interesting question. What will happen to companies which are not certified to this standard? So just to answer that question, Devendra, the standard is compulsory and there will
I know, so I can answer
okay.
as the
Okay, great, Rodney.
head of the regulatory body. Good afternoon, well, good morning, everyone. My name is Ratni Ramnath. I am the manager of the certification division of TTBS, and Michelle Bihari, who would have presented before, works in my division. So what we are doing here is essentially a regulatory program which will be regulated by Trinidad and Tobago Bureau of Standards. And sometimes the word certification confuses persons because for the most part, people are aware of those kinds of voluntary programs which persons will choose to take on. But in the context of this discussion, and for the enforcement of the national compulsory standard, we are not talking about those types of programs. Here, in fact, we are talking about mandatory certification programs because it's part of the enforcement program for the technical regulation, if you want to use that word. So basically, in this case, it's not voluntary. In this case, it's a mandatory certification program, and organizations will have to either be certified, and if you're not certified, the Bureau, unfortunately, would have to ask you to leave the market. I know that there are a number of concerns which are related to that in terms of can I be certified? What is the cost of the certification, etc., etc. But just to alleviate the concerns for now, because this is a program that seeks to enforce a national compulsory standard, if you cannot meet the requirements of the certification program, essentially what that means is that you're not competent enough to be in the market. With that being said, I think most of the operators in this industry would have been operating for a very, very long time. And generally, at least from our preliminary information, most organizations do have a sufficient level of competence to make sure that the products that they are putting out into the market should conform. So we don't anticipate too much problems there. In terms of the cost of the program, we still have to work that out, but that would depend on the conformity assessment activities that we do and the cost of doing those activities, which would include assessments, including audits of the organization's production system and quality system, testing of concrete samples, inspections, etc. So we still have to work those things out, and that would depend on the final standard. But what the Bureau tries to do, especially for mandatory certifications, is that the cost is on a cost recovery basis. So we are not trying to make any money on the industry at all. We are just trying to cover the cost of the assessment activities. So we would try to ensure that it is the least disruptive to the industry as possible. But all of that just to say, the program will be mandatory, and if organizations are not able to meet the requirements of the certification program, they would have to either improve their processes where they can become certified, and very, very last of all is if the person doesn't know how to do that, then they would be asked to leave the industry. But that's really an exceptional case. And that would mean that the person really isn't competent to produce concrete in the first place. So we don't see that being a very, very big problem. I'm seeing a follow-up question from Devendra, so I'll just take it one time. So he said, what is the expected time? Oh, okay, so my stuff just shifted. What is the expected time for companies to become certified before those which are not certified? Sorry, what is the expected time for companies to become certified before those which are not certified have to leave the market? And that's something that we will have to review carefully. So we haven't come up with that yet or made that decision. But what will happen next is that once this standard is finalized and becomes compulsory, we will be developing the conformity assessment program that goes along with that. And when that is done, what we will do is we are going to have another national stakeholder meeting in which we would indicate exactly what the conformity assessment program is, including all the details. And in that national stakeholder meeting, we will inform the industry of the moratorium period. So whenever we are implementing new enforcement measures, there's always a moratorium period that will allow the industry participants, if they have problems with their processes, to fix those. So it's not that we come and tell you from today, if you can't meet the requirements, you're out of the industry. We would give a reasonable amount of time for the industry players to be able to put things in place and get certified before we take any other punitive actions on the industry.
Thank you, Rodney. There's a follow-up question from Lisa as well. How is a non-compliance determined? Is it solely during audits by the TTB?
Yeah, sure. That's a very, very good question. Non-conformances would be based on the requirements of the conformity assessment system, and those would be defined. But basically, non-conformities could come from two things. In this particular program, as Michelle would have previously indicated, we would be looking at two things. Number one would be an assessment of the production process and quality system. So you would be expected to have certain things in place in regard to that, the production system and the quality management system. And that is because of the type of product that this is. This type of product isn't something that you could supply and then exchange at the end of the day. Well, I guess you could remove it, but what that means is that it has a lot of implications for cost and health and safety and all of that. But basically, at the time of supply of the product, the green product is in a liquid state, if we want to call it that. And then by the time it dries and you are able to get the final test results in terms of the compressive strength of the concrete, the product is already in place. So what that means is that the Bureau has no choice but to review the production system and the quality system to ensure that once you are delivering product, it is expected to conform by the time we are able to do the final testing of the product. So we're actually looking at a system for quality assurance here. So that's one area in which non-conformities can be issued. And Michelle Bihari would have indicated all of the major systems that we would be looking at. And those would be things like your raw materials, things like your concrete design. So those kind of things we would pay particular emphasis on. But another way that we can raise non-conformities is if we do sampling and testing of the product and the product fails to conform to the particular requirements, right? Now, in terms of strength and things like that, really and truly the requirements we are looking at will not be housed in a standard because the concrete design depends upon the application of the concrete. So really and truly, what we would be looking at is what you have been asked to supply. So if your customer's civil engineer specifies a concrete of a specific strength or other parameters, that's what we would be looking at to assess the adequacy of your concrete. That's the only way that we can do it. And if we see instances where you are not able to supply what is required, then non-conformities can be raised in those areas. So I hope that's been able to give some clarification on the whole issue of non-compliance.
Thank you, Rodney. So I'd like to invite any more questions to be raised in the chat. We're not seeing any additional comments, or Victor has provided some information. So we would give 5 more minutes for any more questions in the chat. I would just like to state that the public comment period ends on the 20th of August. So I would like to recommend that all the participants submit queries in writing. We have taken note of all the queries and comments and feedback from this session, and I think it has been very useful. But we also encourage written submission. As we go through the development of this particular compulsory standard, after the public comment period is completed and we have addressed the queries, we will submit the draft standard for final approval. So it will be very difficult to make any technical changes after the standard has been approved. The standard covers the technical requirements as well as the compliance requirements and the measures related to non-compliance. So I would encourage everyone to submit the comments in writing and we will address them. And I'm going to put the link in the chat for the standard where it is available for comment on the TTBS's website. So thank you, Devendra. So the link has been included. So are there any additional questions at this time? Okay, so I'm not seeing any further questions or comments. So we'd like to bring the feedback session to a close. And I'd like to thank all the participants for raising the concerns about the issue of equivalence, as well as the compulsory standard for concrete aggregates, and also the questions related to the proposed mandatory product certification scheme. Okay, so there's a comment from Nicholas, and I'll read it. There are some hardwares and small suppliers with 2 or 3 small concrete trucks that batch for residential buyers. What happens to these small suppliers now? I would just like to say that the standard, we cannot distinguish between the small and large. We are looking at the technical requirements. And Rodney, I would invite you to just comment on the certification scheme again.
Yeah, sure, Nandita. I think you already answered the question. This is a regulatory requirement for all ready-mixed concrete. So the standard is generic in nature in that it applies to all organizations, whether small or large. Once you are providing ready-mixed concrete to someone, that means that you fall under the scope of the standard. And further, what it means is that if you are supplying product which is not of suitable or appropriate quality, then you could be putting those persons at risk. So we would have to include all sizes of ready-mixed concrete producers in the program.
Thank you, Rodney. So I'd just like to re-emphasize that the draft standard contains minimum requirements and it looks at safety, protecting the consumer. So again, well, there's another comment, I believe it came from Nicholas. Can a listing of all the ready-mix concrete suppliers, batching plants be provided? I think we would have attempted to answer that by saying that at this time, the presentation that Daryl did is a non-exhaustive list, and we do not have a full listing of all concrete suppliers. Mr. Cardenas from the Trinidad and Tobago Contractors Association would have indicated that they have a directory. So at this time, what we can do is we will share the PowerPoint from Daryl, and that has a lot of useful information, but please do not take it as an authoritative source of all the ready-mix concrete suppliers. That is something that as we roll out our conformity assessment program, that we will also need to ensure that as TTBS, we have that information available. This is why we're having the stakeholder consultation to get the broadest based participation. And just to reply to Nicholas again about a list of the concrete aggregate suppliers, Again, it is a non-exhaustive list that we have at this time. So are there any additional queries? Okay, so I would like to thank everyone for their participation today. The feedback from the session was extremely useful, and we may decide to convene a very specific meeting with the ready-mix concrete producers as well as the concrete aggregate suppliers at a later date. We are almost at the middle of the public comment period, so we have some time until the public comment period closes. So we may decide to have a very specific and focused discussion, especially based on the concerns raised about the equivalence of standards, because we would like to get some further information in terms of the more prevalent standards being used to assess the usage of the British, European standards and the other industry standards mentioned. So thank you for the feedback. It is much appreciated. I would like to invite Mr. Lookbat to say a few words before we officially close today's session.
Thanks, Nadita. And I agree, it was a very engaging session. The presenters did an excellent job, and certainly we got the level of active feedback and contributions. And it's good to see that the standards development process continues to be robust. So thanks to you all for your time and the engagement and the contributions. And we look forward to the furthering of this and other standards development projects. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lookbat. So if there are any further queries, Daryl and I can be contacted directly. So I will put my email in the chat. And again, thank you everyone for participating in the session. We do value all the technical feedback, and we would like to encourage you to comment further and provide additional information that will help us ensure that we have a technically robust document. The principle of equivalence is one that is enshrined in many trade agreements. So it is something that we will take on board. We have a provision for it already in the existing draft, but we just want to be very specific and targeted in terms of what are the foreign standards that are being used. And I would say in the absence of a fully approved national building code, it is something that we're trying to standardize requirements for the construction products themselves. But at the end of the day, all the products and materials and buildings, they have to fit into a agreed structure. So we would look at the equivalence issue very carefully before making any final determination. So again, thank you everyone, and I hope you all have a good day. Please be safe during this time. And I will include my email address in the chat as well as Daryl, and we can be contacted directly with any additional feedback. So thank you everyone, and I'll bring the session to an official close.